and smaller, down to maybe 1 or 2 acres. But the potato was so productive that that's all you needed to feed a family, and the people could be kept alive by this nutritious diet. So the result was population explosion from under 2 million in the 1740s to over 8 million by the 1840s.
Whoa.
So that's a quadrupling of population in 1 century. Now that's in the absence of any economic development. No industrial revolution like in Britain. Britain's population, for example, trebled over the same period, but we didn't have the coal or the iron. On top of that, that was later of course. On top of that, the more that Britain industrialized, the more that Ireland de-industrialized, because cheap machine-produced goods from Britain flooded the Irish market, and this wiped out Irish manufacturers such as they were. And of course the Act of Union, which created not only a single political zone but a single economic zone, it accelerated that process, of these cheap goods from Britain coming in. So this population increase was unsustainable, and eventually disaster struck in 1845, 46, 47, 48, 49. There were complete failures of the potato. 1 million people died of starvation or disease. Within 10 years, another 2 million people disappeared due to emigration, mainly, and then in the century that followed, half of the Irish people born ended up somewhere else. 2/3 of them in the United States. So this decline in population didn't bottom out until the late 50s, early 60s. It's recovered a bit since then, but there's still only 6 million people in Ireland today. 1.5 million in the north, 4.5 million in the south. So we've never recovered our pre-famine population of 8.25 million, which is extraordinary. Most countries have at least doubled their populations in that period. Ours is nearly half. Now the famine, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a very controversial subject, because while these people starved, Ireland continued not only to produce but also to export food. In the large farm commercial agricultural sector, it was business as usual. No embargo was placed on food exports because the London government stuck rigidly to a laissez-faire, free trade, free market economic policy. And that was justified in the name of providence, the will of God, or even that this was somehow the judgment of God on the Irish people. So it was a very Victorian combination of economic and religious dogmas that was the problem here. This was not a natural disaster. Now the famine had far-reaching consequences for Ireland. The obvious one was the halving of the population. It also led to a big decline in the Irish language, because most of those who died or who emigrated were the poorer Gaelic-speaking half of society. And then emigration almost killed the language completely, because knowledge of English was your meal ticket if you were planning life in America, Australia, or Britain itself. So quite often parents who might speak Irish to each other would speak only English to their children, and they thought they were doing them a big favour by preparing them for emigration. Thirdly, the famine and its aftermath completely transformed attitudes to religion, sex and marriage in Irish society. Now, up until recently, we Irish were notorious for our deep, deep sense of Catholic sexual guilt. We were all racked by it, and you couldn't, read an Irish novel, like James Joyce is there, Ed O'Brien, Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes, all this whole thing about sexual. Jesus, we used to go on and on about this, Thankfully, we've overcome these taboos and hang-ups in more recent years. So if you're taking a wander down to Temple Bar tonight, be careful. Times have changed. Strange thing is, though, if you go back to pre-famine Irish society and consider this teeming society, there's no evidence of Catholic sexual guilt there. You've got this rapidly increasing population. And the basis for that was the practice of land subdivision. Because right down to the very bottom of the social pyramid, a relatively large number of people had access to land. It might only be 1 or 2 acres. But if you could grow enough potatoes to feed a family, you're in business. You can marry whoever you like, whenever you like, because you've the means to support a family. Now, this all changed after the famine, because there was a collective realization that this dividing up of land had led to disaster. So that stopped. And then the opposite became the trend, the consolidation of land into larger, more viable holdings. But of course, larger holdings meant fewer holdings. So this process automatically narrowed the marriage market. Because now in a typical farming family, only the eldest son, the guy who inherited the entire farm, only he would be in an economic position to marry. But of course the poor fella would have to wait well into middle age before he got the chance, because he had to wait for both his parents to pass away, especially his widowed mother. Because a widowed mother, while she was alive, she'd be very slow to encourage her eldest son to get married, thus bringing a rival female into the household, God forbid. Oh, wow. And of course the son, for his part, if he's a typical easygoing Irish guy with his mother cooking his food, darning his socks, you know, why bother taking on the hassle of marriage? By the way, did you know that Jesus was Irish? Very strong evidence that Jesus was Irish. He lived at home with his mother until he was 30. She thought he was God. And the clincher, he thought she was a virgin. Moving swiftly on. So when this middle-aged guy did get the chance to marry, the widow mother's gone, if he was planning a family himself, he would marry a woman 20, 30 years younger. So then when he died in turn, he'd leave behind a relatively young widow who then blocked the path to the next eldest son, and so on, generation after generation, perpetuating a pattern of delayed marriage and of a big gap in age at marriage. And we can be pretty sure that these were not love matches. You know, increasingly these were arranged marriages. Just to give you an example from my own family, my maternal grandmother, that's my mother's people, who were all from a farming background, she died in her early 90s in 1982, right? Now, the question is, can anyone guess the year in which my maternal grandfather died? Just do the maths on it. She was in her early 90s, died in 1982. Anyone take a stab at a guess?
64. 70.
64?
52.
52? They're all a long way out.
In the war.
1930.
Oh, no, kidding.
So she was a widow for 52 years, always wore black.
God.
Now, you might think, was his a young tragic death? No. He was 65 when he died.
Oh,
wow. They were married in about 1910. I usually have a picture of them. I don't have it here, actually. But, so she was about 18 or 19, and he, the old goat, was about 45.
Oh, wow.
He still went on to have 8 children.
27.
No Viagra. And then my uncles then, the next generation, same pattern, all married well into middle age. And that was typical. Now, next question is, what happened to the rest of the family who didn't have access to land? What were their options? Well, number one, you emigrated. And as I said, half of those born took that option. Second choice was, you joined the clergy. So people became priests and nuns in huge numbers. So if you had a bright boy in the family, he'd be sort of directed towards the priesthood. And that was the ambition of every Irish mother, to have a priest in the family. In fact, it was said that the seminaries of Ireland were full of the vocations of Irish mothers, not the guys themselves. So that was your second choice. Third choice was you stayed at home, unmarried, and you went insane. Seriously, the rate of mental illness in Ireland went through the roof post-famine. And I think this is linked to the unusually low rate of marriage. Marriage was postponed for so long that over a quarter of adults missed the boat completely, never got the chance to marry, with the consequent isolation and loneliness and presumably sexual frustration of that situation. So you can imagine the pressures. Now, I'm making a big assumption here. I'm assuming that if you're not married, you don't have a sex life. Stop smiling.